Welcome, everyone, to the Dad's Doomsday Guide. Today, we're happy to have aviation expert and attorney Josh Verde on the podcast. Josh became a licensed pilot at the age of 17 and later served as pilot in command of regional airline flights for Continental Express, Delta Connection, and JetBlue. In addition to being a licensed flight instructor for over 20 years, Josh is consulted by media organizations to provide expert insights and opinions on aviation matters. His aviation consulting organization, Aerovise, has been in operation since 2009. Thanks, Josh, for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
To start, how did you get into, wanting to be a pilot? How did that whole thing arise? When I was younger, I wanted to be an Air Force pilot so bad, and my parents looked at me like, oh my God, he's going to go off and get killed somewhere. Lucky for them, my eyesight's terrible, and I'm tall, but I know you're even taller. So how did that whole thing evolve? And I know you kind of dabbled with the idea of maybe doing military service. So how did that break down?
It was very much that classic, I want to be a firefighter when I grow up. It was since, childhood. We traveled a fair amount. I have memories from childhood of, we go on a family vacation. And for me, the highlight of the trip was the plane ride there and back. And my parents thought I was crazy. Here we are, we're in Yosemite, where this is beautiful. And I'm like, yeah. When do we, when's our trip back? Yeah. So, and I love nature, but just for me, the air travel was great. So it was what I wanted to do always. And that kind of put me on that trajectory. So I even went, to a aviation college. I went to a university called Embry-Riddle in Florida, which, really just does aviation for the most part. And got my license while I was still in high school, my first pilot's license, which is the private pilot certificate. Mm-hmm. So it was just kind of a path that I set out on early and stayed with it, and then did it and got there, and then ultimately still love it. It's a great profession, but ultimately needed a little more of a challenge, and that's where I made the transition into being a lawyer.
What about flying? Because for me, it was funny. We met Chuck Yeager when I was really small, and it was weird because he was like living on my grandma was dating a guy who was living on the property of Chuck Yeager, and he was a weird dude, but we got to go on there, and we took us in his house. He showed us the model of I think it was the X1, the Bell that he broke the sound barrier with. Yep. It's a really cool experience. So that even got me more gun-ho to do it. But for you in flying, what about it? Was there one thing that was it mesmerizing that you were high up in the air, the controls, the freedom? What about it drew you at such a young age?
So there was something about, when it all works kind of really well, from let's just say from an airline perspective, right? Keeping a schedule, moving people efficiently, doing it safely. The airplanes themselves, and this is even, I'm talking about my first observations were in the early 80s. They really were well built and did exactly what they were supposed to do. And it was just kind of cool as a little kid to look in a cockpit and see all those buttons and lights and really everything had a purpose and kind of did this, perform this function that was remarkable. There's a bit that Louis C.K. did once on Conan where he was talking about people getting really disgruntled over the Wi-Fi not working on an airplane. And his remark to that was, here you are sitting in a chair in the sky, enjoying the miracle of flight, and you're pissed that the Wi-Fi isn't working. And I think that was it for me. Was the whole thing is kind of miraculous, and just kind of that feeling was validated when I started to fly, and especially when I got my instrument rating. You could take off in very, very low visibility, poor weather conditions, go into the clouds and fly an hour and a half, 2 hours, whatever, never seeing anything at all in the clouds, and then descending only by reference to the instrumentation on the plane and breaking out of the clouds at let's say 600 feet and landing. Mm-hmm. And to do that just based off of the technology that was available in the cockpit kind of validated this thing of this is really kind of an awesome technology, kind of an awesome thing. And so I just got fulfilled through that, seeing how that whole thing works and then challenging myself to learn how to do it and then ultimately doing it, whether as a flight instructor or an airline pilot or in general aviation today. Mm-hmm. To me, the spark is still there.
I had that same feeling. We were on a trip and I was up, you're at cruising altitude recently, and I was walking there. I was like, this is pretty amazing that we're up in the air like this. And then it quickly got replaced by the thought about how safe is this? So, I mean, and I know you never had a close call. I know you said, I think you mentioned in your bullet points that your parents did actually a plane crash. How, I guess, maybe you can kind of give us the rundown of what happened to your parents, but how safe is flying? And I'm sure there's varying degrees, what kind of aircraft you're in, all that kind of stuff. But for an average commercial airline that people fly on every day, how safe are we talking here? Because I know they say, oh, well, it's more common to get in a car wreck. Well, then I'm like, yeah, but it's more common to survive a car wreck too. Like how does that break down? Do you know any kind of guess numbers on that or?
Yeah, I mean, and I'm not trying to shill for an industry or anything, but the truth is that no matter how you break it down, whether it's time spent in the seat traveling or number of passengers moved or people moved, air travel is just far and away safer than anything on the ground. With the exception of maybe rail, but even rail has had some problems where there's been some actually recent, I think, train accidents and stuff. So definitely over a car, a bus, anything in an automobile, it's way safer. I think what's happened over history is that aircraft disasters are so spectacular and so sensational that we really can't turn away, and we see them, and it gives us the impression of, well, this is really dangerous, and it is. There's no doubt about it that flying is dangerous, but there's a lot of things that are in place that make it overall more safe. And of course, this is just only improved over time. Generally speaking, the safety metrics for aviation have just been kind of a graph up, versus there being, and there are occasional dips and stuff here and there. But overall, we've just been improving and improving and improving. And I think that will continue, although I do have some concerns about this move toward single pilot cockpits, or maybe even autonomous flights that are being driven by a pilot shortage. I think ultimately they're going to blame it on cost, but that might change things a little bit, but we'll have to see. But overall, by far, if you're going to pick a method of transportation, commercial aviation is safer than ground transportation.
And it's an interesting couple points you mentioned there. So I had no idea they were transitioning to single pilot cockpits. And that's kind of why I wanted to talk to you too, because like the show is like, how do you survive like a really deadly situation? And we'll get into that. But also it's to dispel myths if there's any kind of irrational fears about certain things. But also too to get a little insight into like the whole aviation industry, which I think a lot of people, get on a plane, get off. They don't really think about all the little behind the scenes things that are going on. But I had no idea they were moving toward that. Now, I've heard a lot of different blame passed around for pilot shortages. What is it that's actually causing that? Is it like the COVID thing? You heard like all these different reasons. What, I guess, is that the kernel of that?
My suspicion, and there might be some data out there that validates this, but my suspicion is just a cultural shift where young people kind of choosing a profession have, for whatever reason, not really been as motivated to get into aviation. There was some bad press. There's actually been several decades of bad press about the career. When I started working at ExpressJet, which at the time was Continental Express, I think my starting annual salary was just about $20,000.
Wow.
And this is in 2004. So it isn't like this was in 1960 where that was, some sort of livable, wage. It was not a livable wage, especially for a professional, somebody who had to have licenses and training. And for the longest time, the airlines got away with that because of this. And I love my fellow pilots, and I'm still a pilot, so this is a little bit of a dig, but it's true. There's this concept of we'll fly for food. In fact, it's a slogan that was used before on various pilot career websites. And the notion is that flying is so cool as a job that I do it for free. And I've heard people actually say that. Of course, when they say that, I just want to throttle them. Like that's if it requires skill and if you're good at it, never do it for free. And so the airlines have exploited this, or at least did exploit it. And the wages kind of were stagnant for a while, especially starting out. They were very, very low, and the benefits were kind of questionable, and the work schedules were extreme. And I think as social media became more and more prevalent, the word got out that there was some downside to being an airline pilot, especially a regional airline pilot starting out. And that may have turned some people off. And so what happened was there was this vacuum. And for a while, I can't remember the last time that I actually saw this report. I want to say it was around 2010. For a while there, the FAA would put out information about commercial pilot applicants that were in the pipeline. They could actually release data and say, well, we've had so many numbers of commercial pilot applicants. And that would give you a little bit of insight into how many people were training to head towards that, that profession. Mm-hmm. And it was declining. And you coupled that with data that the airlines had. There's a mandatory retirement age as an airline pilot. It used to be 60, and they changed it to 65. So because there's a mandatory retirement age, they were able to kind of forecast where this would become a problem. And I think that's what happened. I think there was some negative press about the industry for a little while there, and people just lost interest.
So it's not necessarily that it's like boring, right? Because someone's going just to point A to point B to point A to point B, they maybe get tired of it, or is it just the money's not good still and not really attracting your higher quality applicants?
It could be that it's boring. Mm-hmm. And the reason why I say that is because that's one of the factors that I considered when I got out of it.
I was going to ask you, were you getting bored?
I was. I felt like a bus driver, which is funny because you are. Mm-hmm. You are a bus driver. And, it's a very big bus, expensive bus with wings, and it goes up to 35,000 feet. But that's essentially what you do. And, that's not a dig at bus drivers, right? Mm-hmm. It's an essential job, and it's got its pros and it has its cons. But there's a lot of rote activity in flying, a lot of repetitive action, a lot of, once you've seen all the different weather during all the different months and all the different areas that you fly, you kind of get used to it, and you're like, okay, well, it's another nor'easter. I know what to expect. It just becomes, for me anyway, personally, it became kind of mundane.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think that does factor into it. And there's other factors too. Most airlines are unionized. And so the pilots are. So you're part of a union, and that means that there's a contract. And oftentimes your career progression is solely based on your seniority. And for a lot of people, especially now, I think in the younger generations, that's an off-putting concept. You mean I can't be recognized for my ability and receive some sort of reward for that? I can't excel because I'm a good pilot over somebody else? No, they don't care. Just you're a number. You're a number, and it's solely based on your time of service. So there's all sorts of factors that kind of play into that. But it's real. The pilot shortage is definitely real, and we're going to have to face that here very soon. And that's going to be I'm going to get lots of calls about that.
So you think they're going to move toward autonomous flights and just no one's in the cockpit? Or obviously every industry is moving that way, and like they talk about, big rigs and everything being driven by themselves, and it's like people go, I think some people think it's sooner than it's going to be, and other people think, you're still kind of a little bit away from this technologically wise. And you think that it will obviously make it less safe to fly for some time, or you're looking at kind of a downtrend now as things get a little dicey?
There's several ways to look at this. And right now, I don't think that they enhance safety. And I would just put this out as a basis for that thought. The push to approve single pilot cockpits or even no pilot cockpits, right? Autonomous AI, whatever. It's not being driven right now by safety, right? No one is saying, well, single pilot cockpits are safer. No pilot cockpits are safer, so that's what we should do. That's not the motivator currently. The motivator currently is we don't have any pilots. So I think that's a good starting point for the analysis. And it used to be back in, like, let's say the 50s, the 60s, most commercial aircraft manufacturers designed these planes to have 3 pilots. Really, it was two pilots and a flight engineer. And I think the last plane that had that was probably in the 70s, the DC-10 maybe. They phased that out real quick, and they figured through technology and some automation they could do two pilots, and that was worked for a long time. The safety benefit of two pilots is primarily, well, it's two things really. The two main safety benefits are, number one, it's always good to have two pairs of eyes, two brains, two sets of experience, in the industry, and you can bounce ideas off each other, and you can make an informed decision versus a rash decision with certain things. All of that really helps. Backing each other up, what we call a CRM or crew resource management concept, that all really works well. And there's decades of data that shows that enhances safety. But there's also another kind of morbid benefit, which is there have been multiple crashes, fatal crashes driven by a single actor pilot who kind of lost it and committed suicide. Yeah. There was the Germanwings crash. There's a couple others where the nations, because there's one, Egypt Air is one that's rumored to be that. Of course, Egypt denies this greatly, but there's multiple. You have that, what was the airline? Malaysia, the 777 that vanished over the Indian
I just
Ocean.
looked that up yesterday. I was looking at some stuff to chat about, and I was like, oh yeah, that's still missing. They still haven't found anything, so they don't know why, but it's rumored to believe it's some kind of suicidal thing.
Right. And so that having that redundancy, that extra person, there's some safety benefit there, right? For sure. So you can't have a single actor kind of go off reservation and do something dangerous. If you cut that back, if you go to single pilot, that protection is no longer there. That single pilot can have a bad day. He could lose their mind. Who knows what. There's other kind of less dramatic incapacitation that can happen. Pilots have heart attacks. Pilots have strokes. So I don't think safety is the motivator here. And so as a result, it's likely that reducing the pilot number down to 1 or 0, at least initially, means a hit against safety, or maybe we have an increase in incidents.
That's always worrisome when technology isn't like either through ease of use or safety, or there's some reason why technology is pushing ahead like that. And when it's driven by another factor, like you said, that's always worrisome. And it should stop people and go, okay, hey, wait a minute here, because like you said, you're shuttling people in the air. I mean, you're responsible for a lot of lives, and to be making decisions based off money, which too often happens, I think is worrisome for sure.
Money is definitely going to play a factor here, play a role. There's something that I perceive, and I don't know if maybe I'm just old and different with my thinking here, but I perceive, especially amongst younger folks, kind of an overconfidence in technology. Technology is great, and there's no reason to just reject it off the bat. But I mean, to go into it with the flip of that and say, well, technology is always better, is a mistake.
Yeah.
And so I think that there might be some folks that, and if you discuss this topic and say, well, what are we going to have? One pilot, or are we going to have no pilot, just autonomous? I think it's probably going to start off with the one pilot and end up the autonomous. But there's probably going to be some people who say, really just skip the one pilot and go to the AI, because the technology is so great. Because they're so confident in it. We have self-driving cars, or we will here shortly. Why not just have self-flying airplanes? There's actually right now available to general aviation aircraft. And this is cool. It's cool, but it's also kind of like, experimental. So it's use only in an emergency. There's this feature on some general aviation aircraft, small airplanes, where if you just get lost, and you get, completely flustered as a pilot or whatever, you can push this button and an autopilot will engage, and it will just land you at the nearest airport.
Oh, wow.
And it's like auto land for small airplanes. So we're headed in that direction. And but there's all sorts of security questions. Can these planes be hacked? Can they be taken over? Imagine like, a 777 or a 787, a Dreamliner or Airbus, whatever, a large airplane with hundreds of people on board and tons of fuel. that has been hacked and taken over by some kid in his mom's basement with a joystick. I mean, that would be kind of the innocent. There's no innocent hack here,
Yeah.
but a bad actor could inflict an awful lot of destruction in that scenario. So there's a lot here to consider, and I hope that the inevitability of that is kind of slowed down by the caution and the emphasis on safety that really aviation demands. It just demands, because it's an inherently dangerous thing.
How many crashes are because of mechanical failure, like instrumentation going awry, versus human error? Because when you talk about having the two pilots and kind of a redundancy there, and I guess how many pilots are actually equipped to have the experience to make those decisions when things start going bad, like, hey, this isn't right, we need to manually do something. That, I'm sure that kind of varies all over the place, and maybe it's getting a little worse as pilots tend to get less experience. I don't know. How does it break down?
Yeah. So there's a human component to every fatal crash. And here's an example, right? There was this crash of an Alaska Airlines MD-80 off the coast of California back in, I think it was the early 90s. And the pilots did nothing wrong, and the weather was perfect. But a component on the airplane failed, and it was really probably attributable to a maintenance error, or just missing this problem, or maybe even a manufacturing error. The pilots actually performed spectacularly in an aircraft that really was just disabled to the point of crashing was nearly inevitable. So in that instance, you want to say, well, what did the pilots do wrong? Probably nothing. And the aircraft probably didn't do anything wrong. It was just maintained wrong. And so the human factors component there happened on the ground amongst the maintenance crew. But mechanical failure, like pure mechanical failure, is not usually the largest contributing factor in plane crashes. Although I will say this, and I think this is mostly driven by our access to videos and cameras on mobile phones and things. Now, I don't know if this has been confirmed by the NTSB, but it seems like there has been a slight uptick in purely mechanical incidents, and some of those have been fatal. So there was, I think it was in 2017, there was a Southwest Airlines flight that had an engine failure, and the engine failure was uncontained, which means basically just, an engine can fail, but if any parts come off, it's contained inside the actual nacelle of the engine. Or you can have a spectacular engine failure where all sorts of pieces of metal fly out at high speed, and that's what happened here. And it actually pierced the fuselage, broke one of the windows, and sucked one of the passengers out.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
Right. So that would be a purely mechanical problem that resulted in a fatality. And I am perceiving there's been a slight uptick in the mechanical issues. Thankfully, they're not fatal usually, but they're spectacular. And if somebody catches them on their phone, their camera, makes it to social media, and people are like, wow, this is crazy. This engine exploded. There's a huge fire. And hopefully today we can talk about that, because there's a lot as a passenger that you can do to kind of prep yourself for how to respond to something like that.
Yeah.
Because a lot of this stuff looks awful, but the reality is that it's very, very survivable. And it's very, very likely that your crew is going to handle it right.
Because that one, they actually did a rapid descent, landed the plane, and everybody was okay. But despite obviously the poor woman who got sucked out. And right. I think they said, I was glancing past the article, was it metal fatigue or something that they eventually blamed it on? And that begs the question, and I think he's an engineer at Northrop Grumman down here, and I think he was mentioning something about how they don't really inspect the planes, nose to tail every single flight. It's like coming from the manufacturer, it's given like a check, it's good to go. And then unless something's coming on and alerting the pilots that something's wrong, they're not going to necessarily go check it out. And I was like, so you're just driving and up in the sky, kind of waiting for the engine light to come on, and like, whoa. So how does that, who's actually checking it? Is anybody checking it? Because like I I struggle with irrational fear of flying. Like I have to remind myself, hey, knock it off. You're going to be fine. And I've flown a bunch of times, but still every time I go up in the air, I'm like, man, I hope they
Right.
check this thing, So it's, how does that actually work behind the scenes? And
so, so a typical airline, US airline, right? There's multiple layers of maintenance. And I'll just take, a hypothetical 737 working for whatever airline on a given day. All right. Usually overnight, there is some sort of what they call like a system routine check or a routine overnight maintenance. And it's the simple stuff. They check all the lights. They check the hydraulic fluid levels, things like that, air pressure and tires, all the simple stuff that can be done over a couple of hours. And also if there's any other write-ups or discrepancies that haven't been cleared, that can be cleared out. Updating computers, because there's databases, navigational databases and things like that. It's all done overnight, usually nightly. That's really important stuff because I don't know, to this day, I can't figure out why this is true, but it's absolutely true. Planes that don't get touched every day, planes that don't get flown every day, moved around every day, maintained every day. And it's true about boats too, apparently. I'm not a boat person, but I've heard this. They develop problems. The equipment actually works better when it's used regularly. So this is part of a normal day for, like, let's say a 737. Then every flight, you have a member of the flight crew who does a walk around. And at most airlines, there's both a post-flight walk around and a pre-flight walk around. And that's meant to catch some of the more obvious stuff. Bent metal, dents, fluid leaks, a crack in a fan blade, maybe, if such a thing exists. Mm-hmm. And those are caught. And of course, the cockpit too has annunciators and stuff that can alert a crew to a problem. And then they can write it up and ground the flight if necessary. So there's kind of a constant check of the mechanical health of the airplane. Mm. Then there's also scheduled heavy maintenance. So things like C checks and D checks. A D check is insane. They'll take the plane out of flying status. They'll fly it to a maintenance facility and they basically disassemble it. Mm. They'll pull all the seats out, the floors, the panels, every inspection port. It's checked, it's rebuilt, it's repaired. You talk about metal fatigue with engines. One of the things they do is something called non-destructive testing, where they'll actually use X-rays and ultrasound and dye penetrance to check for things like fatigue cracks and things. Oh, okay. So there's a ton of maintenance that is both available should something go wrong and also scheduled to make sure these planes are in good shape. Overall, I don't think that maintenance is really currently it's in a good shape. It's in good shape. We really do a lot to maintain and watch out for mechanical issues with airliners.
Okay, so you don't feel like the money thing has impacted that yet in terms of skimping on, we don't really need to go fly and do this whole big check because, it's fine.
I don't think so. But then you see a video on Twitter of, a 777 engine that has just flown apart and it's flying on its way to Hawaii and the engine is vibrating like crazy because of it through a fan blade. And I think about the thousands of hours that I flew, my airplanes at ExpressJet, and I never had anything like that happen. I never had a single engine failure. I think we didn't even have to shut it down. We had an engine problem once that was minor. It just required moving the throttle to idle. We didn't have to shut it down.
Okay.
So to me, it stands out as being a little odd. There have been a couple of high-profile, uncontained engine failures, and when those occur, especially more than just once in a blue moon, makes me think maybe there's something going on there. But it doesn't appear to be a system-wide or industry-wide problem. Those appear to be just kind of like flukes that have popped up. So from my perspective, I am very comfortable with every U.S. airlines maintenance currently. It appears they're all still doing very, very well in keeping those planes in good shape.
Now, I know there's websites that say like what airlines are safer. And now is there truth to that? Is it like just luck, random? Do some actually spend more money on maintenance and making sure things are more up? I mean, I'm sure like Spirit Airlines always gets dumped on, But I mean,
Spirit's actually really good. It's amazing. I have a friend who's a captain there. They
Okay.
actually do a really good job. The answer is a very qualified yes, right? I mean, every airline has the opportunity to develop its own training, maintenance, whatever that has to be overseen and approved by the FAA. So sure, there's little differences between airlines, but I don't think any that are so drastic that I would say, oh yeah, airline X is, they're a flying death trap. Don't go on their plane. I don't think there's any US airlines that fit that definition currently. There is one thing though that I think I personally look out for, and it's the flight crew. There's definitely, especially in this kind of pilot shortage environment that we're in, there's definitely, at least from my perception, a kind of a experience gap between the pilots of a major airline and the pilots who fly the regional aircraft, the smaller regional aircraft. They are, and always have been, but now especially, they tend to be the lower time pilots, the more inexperienced pilots, and that experience really does help. It's very, very important when it comes to decision making, and there's going to be always this until they take the pilots out of the cockpit, a decision making component that goes to the safety of flight when we talk about airline flights. So I don't avoid them. I don't say I'm not going to fly on a regional airliner because, number one, I think I'd be a hypocrite if I said that. But and truly, they are trained and there's they're checked out and whatever. But there's definitely kind of an understandable experience gap there, simply because those airlines tend to employ the lower time pilots. Whether or not that translates into a decrease in safety, that's debatable.
So the emergency hit and they were going down. Like I think it was the Hudson one where the pilot landed it in the Hudson. And I think he had a lot of experience. I mean, if you're going down in an emergency situation, obviously the pilot with more experience is going to have more, I guess, flexibility in terms of decision making if something needs to be done, or maybe not trusting your instruments or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I think that's a fair statement.
Okay.
There's other more routine things that come up that really require both experience and I think also like just command. You have to. I find that older, more experienced pilots are like, I don't really care if I'm going to get in trouble for this. I'm going to do what's right. And so something that is just a perpetual issue, and I don't think we ever will find a solution for this, but it has to do with fuel. You take off before you take off in your A320 or whatever. The dispatcher, because all these airlines have dispatchers, will provide kind of a minimum fuel. You have to take off with this amount of fuel in order to make it to the destination, and also have some extra fuel for flying to an alternate if the weather is questionable, and then some extra time to pad it in there. One important thing to remember about airplanes is it's not like a car where you run out of gas or you run out of charge or whatever, and you can just roll to the side of the road and call AAA, and someone comes with a gas can. Can't do that. Yeah. If you run out of gas in the air, like you're going to be landing somewhere close. So it costs money to carry extra fuel because it makes the plane heavier, which means it will burn more fuel. We call it tankering. And so airlines are always trying to dispatch with the least amount of fuel necessary, within a safety margin, of course, to get to the destination and then also be legal. And so this was a constant battle when I was an airline captain. And fortunately, my airline was more into letting the captains decide and erring on the side of safety. So no one really got in trouble for taking a little more fuel or whatever. But the reason why I bring this up is because let's say you take off your airline flight and you're headed to Philadelphia or wherever, and you get there and the weather has really gotten bad. That happens. It's worse than forecast. And the visibility is terrible and the wind is terrible. And you try to land and you can't because you can't see the runway, or the wind is so much that you just can't land. Well, now you have to divert. But everyone's diverting because the weather is bad for everyone. And so there's congestion. And then getting to your alternate airport becomes a challenge. And it's at times like those where you really have to have a flight crew that can say, we're not going to hold, be in a holding pattern for longer than 15 minutes before we just pick an airport and go to it because of the real risk of fuel exhaustion. And so that kind of command and experience or knowledge to handle that comes from flight experience. Okay. And that's why I say things like, these lower time pilots, I'm sure they're capable. I'm sure they've done it. I was a low time pilot and I did it, made those decisions and did them safely. But it's just one of those things where maybe having a little more flight time under your belt results in more safety. So for me, that's something I think about, but I've never not taken a flight because I perceived that the flight crew was inexperienced.
Yeah. Next time I walk in a plane, I'm going to look at their faces. How old are you? How long have you been flying for?
Oh, don't, because you will scare yourself. I have to tell this story. This is a really good on that topic. I had a crew one time when I was working at ExpressJet. We had a layover in Little Rock, Arkansas, which was downtown, which actually at the time was a really popular layover for us because they had great bars and things to do in Little Rock. So the plane that I flew, the Embraer 145, was a 50-seat jet. We had 3 crew members. We had pilot, co-pilot, or captain, first officer, and 1 flight attendant. So we get to our hotel, and they were great people, lots of fun. We're friends to this day. And we went and changed and said, let's meet downstairs. We'll go out and get a bite to eat, grab some drinks. We go to, I think it was the Flying Saucer, I don't know, some bar or whatever, and they have a bouncer at the door carding. And I show my ID and I'm ready to go. And I'll turn to my first officer and my flight attendant, and they're both giving me like this sad look, this like puppy dog look. And I'm like, what's wrong? And the first officer goes, I'm 19. and I'm like, what? And the flight attendant goes, yeah, I'm 18. And I'm like, what? And the bouncer's like, you can't, they can't come in. And I remember I'm like, all right, well, I guess we're going to Fridays, so it was just, man. I was flying with just really, really young people. That was a time where, again, there was kind of not a shortage, but there was a hiring boom. And so they were hiring less experienced people. They were great at their job, but it kind of, that particular issue came up during the layover when we wanted to go out and grab a bite to eat and a drink.
Yeah. I don't think as a passenger, I'd want to hear that. I'd be like, oh, goddamn.
Yeah. Well, they would do that. They would peek into the cockpit, the passengers, and just kind of look. And this one first officer that I'm talking about, they would look in, it would be like, hey, oh my God, it's a kid. I mean, that happened. So
now, do pilots ever get worried about turbulence? I feel like turbulence is such a thing where it's like, it starts shaking. I start, white knuckling the chair a little bit. You look around and see if other people are doing it. Depending on your experience, you might, be less worried about it. Is that ever a sign of, obviously I'm sure it could be a sign, but when is that worrisome? Do pilots ever be like, oh man, this is a lot? Because I mean, it's generally weather determined, right? Not necessarily like something malfunctioning with an engine or something like that.
Yeah, it's always an external factor. Almost always weather. There is something called wake turbulence, which could mean you're flying near another airplane, but that's a whole other thing separately. But yeah, generally speaking, turbulence is not anything that's dangerous to the airplane. It's massively uncomfortable. I hate it as a passenger to this day, and I'm a former airline pilot. If we're sitting in moderate or worse turbulence, my first gripe is, why aren't they changing the altitude to find a smoother ride? Because that's usually an option. Not always. Usually there could be congestion or something, other airplanes. But usually there's a couple things that you can do to find a smoother ride. But yeah, there's not really any risk to the airplane. The real risk is to the occupants. You can encounter kind of like sudden severe turbulence that can throw people out of their seats. That can throw galley carts in the air. And those can cause real injuries. I mean, like there's been broken backs, broken bones. So the plane's fine. Plane lands just fine ultimately. But the best advice I can give there is really, really follow the seatbelt sign if you can. If you're in your seat, absolutely wear your seatbelt because there can be sudden turbulence. And I have hit my head on the ceiling of airplanes before, standing and hitting turbulence. Nothing that injured me, but I mean, I've had that happen before. So yeah, I think overall it's mostly just uncomfortable. But it's something that the pilots should always be aware of. Number one, because who really wants to fly around knowing that your passengers, that a percentage of them are terrified, about what's going on. That's no fun.
Yeah.
But also it is related to weather. So, you can usually find smoother rides and, that's another thing that comes with experience, truly. At this point in my pilot career, I see weather and I know the safer side to go around it. I know what the ride is going to be like in, like, let's say, embedded cumulus or cumulonimbus. Those things come with experience. And yes, weather is, to this day, a very real hazard to planes. It's just that we usually avoid it.
Okay.
So the real serious stuff is avoided. And the stuff that doesn't really pose a threat, you can usually go through or kind of evade cells as you're flying around and stuff. So it's not a threat to aircraft that should be minimized, but usually everyone's conducting their flight in such a way that turbulence, if you feel it at all, is just uncomfortable and not actually a threat to the plane.
Yeah, there was once I was flying in college for basketball, and we were in a smaller plane, and I forget what state we were going over. It could have been Utah. I don't know, but we were like moving, and they had to change probably 4 times. And like the last time I looked out, and we were pretty low, and I was like, and it was just like one of my first times flying, and I was like 18 or 19. I hadn't flown very much before then. And it was just like multiple changes. And then I was just like, oh God. And I was squeezing it was funny because everybody was looking at me, like laughing at me at first because I was like nervous. But then a few more like minutes in and they were kind of like getting nervous. And it was just like, oh, it's terrible. Because you hit those pockets that push you. It almost feels like it pushes you down and you kind of like lose your stomach from it. Like you're going down a hill. What is that? Is that just like
if you were out west, it's almost certainly what we call mountain wave turbulence. And so generally speaking, not generally speaking, like truly, the jet stream moves really just west to east. Okay, there's dips and stuff in it, but the prevailing winds aloft are usually west to east. So what happens is these winds, they blow over let's say the Rockies, and the mountains act like, like a stone in a river that creates an eddy. And so there's this burbling of the air that goes downstream from the mountain range. And I have felt mountain wave turbulence over Tennessee. And it wasn't because of the Smokies. It was because of the Rockies. I mean, that turbulence can sometimes persist for hundreds of miles. And it feels different. It absolutely feels different. It's the kind where the plane kind of lurches or maybe suddenly drops.
Yeah.
You can feel mountain wave turbulence as opposed to, like, let's say, your typical convective turbulence in a thunderstorm or near a thunderstorm. That's more jolting and kind of repetitive. Also, you can have clear air turbulence, which a lot of people can't stand. I can't stand it because there's no visual cue to where it may be or where it's smooth or where it's rough.
Yeah.
But clear air turbulence happens where you have a shear between, let's say, a jet stream core and then outside the jet stream where the air is more slowly moving. So there's all sorts of different things. And again, this is something where the pilots really ought to be tuned to this. And ought to always kind of strive to have the smooth ride. And many do. Whenever there's turbulence in an area, you can almost always hear over ATC pilots asking, you got any smooth rides out there? Where are the smooth rides? They're asking ATC, what planes at what altitudes are not complaining about the turbulence? Because I want to go there. I want to be wherever they are. But then sometimes you have pilots that are just like, sitting there in the cockpit bouncing around and like, yeah, everything's fine. So, this doesn't faze me at all. I'm a former military pilot. So, but yeah, generally speaking, the risk is, if you want to protect yourself, wear your seatbelt and don't get up and walk around when there's an area of turbulence, because that's really where the injuries occur.
Have you seen that Key and Peele skit where like one of them's a stewardess and then the other one's like a passenger and he has to go to the bathroom and have you seen that one?
No.
Oh, you have to look it up.
Someone's asked me about it though, so I have to go.
It's hysterical. He goes and then the turbulence is terrible, but I won't spoil it for you, but it's really funny.
This is my worst turbulence story, and this is bad. This is really bad. In my opinion, the worst weather system to fly in. It's not a thunderstorm. I mean, don't go fly through a thunderstorm, right? It's not a thunderstorm. It's not a hurricane. Actually, surprisingly, hurricanes and tropical storms are I've only ever experienced light turbulence flying around them or over top of them. the worst weather system to fly in is a nor'easter. It is the worst to fly in. And if you're a passenger and you want to kind of check the weather before you go fly, and you want to see, a weather chart or whatever and determine whether or not you're going to have a terrible time, what you're looking for is what we call prog charts or surface analysis charts. You can find them, just have to Google them. And you're looking for tightly wound or tight concentric isobars. You've probably seen it on a weather chart at some point, but you'll see a big L for low pressure system and a bunch of really, really tightly concentric lines around it. That is a low pressure system. And whenever you see those tight isobars, you can assume there's going to be lots of wind and turbulence. So I had this flight one time from Albany, New York to Newark, New Jersey. Short flight, 45 minutes, 50 minutes. It was moderate to extreme turbulence from liftoff to touchdown. And there was not a smooth altitude to be found anywhere over New York. The turbulence was so bad as we were descending into New Jersey that my eyeballs could not focus on the instruments. We were shaking so bad that I couldn't read the instruments. I mean, like literally shaking. And so and we're both having this problem. The captain and I was a first officer at the time. We're strapped in as tight as we possibly can. The autopilot failed because you can overpower the autopilot in most airplanes and kind of it'll just trip off. It doesn't break. It just kind of says, "Oh, you want to fly now? Okay," it'll just trip off. So the forces on the flight controls cause the autopilot to trip off, to fail. So we're hand flying, which is probably better. And I wish I had pulled the recording of this because there's the tower controller at Newark asked me, he said, "How's the ride?" And I just keyed the mic and I said, "Severe to extreme from 10,000 and below." I mean, there's no smooth altitude. Now, here's where it gets gross. We parked at the gate and, the door's closed and locked for the whole flight. But usually after we park at the gate and turn the engines off, we reach back and unlock the door and the flight attendant opens the door. Park at the gate, we unlock the door, and as she opens the door, I am hit with the overwhelming smell of vomit. And the entire plane all the passengers, as far as we can tell, used their air sickness back. Oh, it was the most disgusting thing I've ever experienced. And everyone looked green. Everyone's getting off, and we're saying bye, have a great day, bye, and they're just green and clutching and getting off the plane. I mean, it was so bad. It was so bad, and everyone experienced that. Everyone flying into Newark that day everyone flying in the Northeast experienced that. So to this day, if I have to go, and it's usually always the Northeast that experiences this, if I have to go fly up there and there's a nor'easter, I will legitimately change my plans because it's not so much the vomit, although I don't want to experience that, but it's the tremendous amount of delay that those types of weather systems cause region-wide. It's everyone's going around. You can't land, so you do a go around and divert to another airport. It creates massive system-wide delays and cancellations, and I don't have time for that. And I don't want to smell puke. So that was the worst.
Terrible.
Yeah, but the not being able to see the screens was really something else. I have not since that day have I ever experienced that level of turbulence, but that was the worst turbulence, and it was constant. There was not a smooth altitude.
That's terrible. So the plane, you were jerking so violently that the plane thought you wanted to manually fly it and turned off the autopilot? Yeah,
basically. Yeah, the plane was moving so much and the autopilot's trying to correct, like the wind is basically moving the plane. And the autopilot's saying, "Well, I'm being told that to maintain this altitude, but I'm being pushed out of the altitude." And so at some point it just kind of gives up. It says, I'm not able to hold the altitude.
You do it.
Fault. Yeah. And it kicks off. And, there's thankfully all airplanes, when their autopilot deactivates either through pilot input or if it fails, there's an alert, so it isn't like, the plane was out of control and it was flyable. It wasn't like we were out of control, but it was just rough. It was very, very rough. It was not a good time to be flying.
How close are you to just like saying, hey, we can't land, and then like doing a circle around or going to another airport? Or is it not? What level does that take for you to be like, hey, this isn't safe?
I wonder this when I see there's YouTube videos that are out there of, bad weather systems. For whatever reason, it's always a European airport, and they film these planes coming into land, and it's super rough, and they have to go around because they're not stable. And I know that in every one of those go-arounds, those pilots are thinking, do not go around. I do not want to go around, because it means going back into that weather for another 10, 15, 20 minutes while you get vectored back around to land. We got to land this thing. We got to land this thing. But at some point, you have to overcome that. They call it get there-itis. You have to overcome that and do the thing that's most safe, which is, you don't want to continue a landing if you're going to go off the end of the runway, the side of the runway or whatever, if you're not stable. So yeah, that's an option. I mean, sometimes what happens is the wind is too strong and it exceeds what we call the maximum crosswind component. So airplanes have a limit in terms of what they have demonstrated, or what their test pilots at Boeing or Airbus have demonstrated in terms of the maximum crosswind. Well, if you go to an airport where there's only one runway or maybe two, but the wind is coming from a direction where you just can't avoid a crosswind, and the crosswind is 40 knots, you're not landing there. Like you're just that exceeds the airplane and pilot's capability. And so the solution there is don't dispatch. Like if it's going to be that way, don't do the flight, cancel the flight. Or if it comes up and you find it out en route that the weather is that severe, divert to another airport and wait it out. It's that kind of that. Thankfully, we in the U.S. we have an air traffic control system and an airport system, and really the airlines have support systems that allow that to be an option. And it's inconvenient. There's no doubt about it for the passengers, but it's not nearly as inconvenient as going off the side of the runway or something, some incident.
Probably a good time to ask you. I've always kind of wondered. I mean, maybe it's a little bit obvious, but why do most crashes happen on takeoff and landing, or descent and ascent? What is the reason for that? Is it just that's when you encounter these winds, or it's just more a difficult task? And every now and then you'll hear a horror story, like at 35,000 feet, something happens, the plane breaks apart. But I think the majority, and correct me if I'm wrong, happen at takeoff and landing. And how come?
Well, takeoff is the most critical phase of flight. And the reason for that is that if you had let's say you had an engine failure, right before takeoff, the plane is slow, the plane is heavy. It's now been robbed of 50% of its power. It's just a very critical phase of flight where you really need crew skill and attention to make it work. So that's part of the issue. The proximity to the ground is a big deal too, because you can have a lot go wrong at altitude, and that altitude is your friend. So, let's just say, and this has happened before, it's very rare, thankfully, but let's just say you had some sort of flight control malfunction that put the airplane into a roll or inverted or something. Thankfully this is a very rare. Don't worry about this. This is not something that's likely to happen.
I don't want to divert you from the story, but can an airline roll and still maintain flight, or is it going down? Okay.
I mean, all planes can, really. I mean, for the most part. They shouldn't be put into that. I mean, some planes are rated for more aerobatic, more stress on the airplane.
Yeah, it's not going to break apart as it's doing that.
No, I mean, no.
Okay.
If it's done right, if it is overstressed, if its speed is overstressed, or its maximum G loading is overstressed, then yes, it can break apart. But if you did like a 1G roll or whatever, like any airplane can do that.
Okay.
But the altitude allows you to recover. So like it would be terrifying. It would be absolutely terrifying to the passengers. It's like a roller coaster ride. But if that happened at 30,000 feet, you've got so much altitude in which to solve the problem that it's survivable. Whereas if that kind of a control issue happens close to the ground, you don't have that safety buffer of altitude to work out the problem. So it's just closer to the ground is a more critical phase of flight for dozens of reasons.
kind of going along with just airlines or types of planes, what are the safest, I guess, historically planes to fly in? I know there was a lot of controversy over was it 737 MAX or whatever it was? And they're like, hey, is it just a manufacturing problem? Has that been a lot of media hype? Are there planes that are kind of like, if I could fly on this one, I'd rather fly on this one. This one's a workhorse. This one has a good safety record.
Yeah.
Does it break down that way at all? Or
now, not so much. I mean, truly, all Boeings are great. All Airbus aircraft are great. All Embraers are great. Bombardier is another company. They know their business. They know the engineering now. Mm-hmm. The MAX, that was more of a problem with decision making at Boeing, in my opinion, than it was an actual physical problem with the plane. Were there mistakes? No doubt about it. I think now, though, it's all taken care of. The training has been, put in place or whatever. So I would have no qualms flying on a MAX. There were times when there were aircraft-specific concerns. Like I have vivid memories of the DC-10, which is no longer in passenger operation anywhere in the world, but FedEx still flies them for cargo. Mm-hmm. But there was a time when the DC-10 was like really a scary airplane to fly because of what really amounts to a design flaw. That if something went wrong, it could go really wrong because of how they had constructed the airplane's hydraulic system. But they learned from that, and so the redundancy is really good now. I don't really have any. There's no plane that I avoid.
That's good.
Let's just put it that way.
That's good to know. Because I know there's so much fear around the MAX thing, and like another one crashed, and you're like, oh my god, am I going to fly on one of those things if I schedule a flight? And
I would now, and now this sort of solved the problem, which was mostly a communication problem, like informing the pilots of what this system did and that it even existed at all. The MAX is a great plane. I've really gotten fond of Airbus lately for some reason. Just I've flown on them more often, and I don't know why. They're just great airplanes. But Boeing's great airplanes. And so the fear, if you're an apprehensive flyer, if you're a fearful flyer, I wouldn't focus so much on what airline am I flying. Which one's safest? Because right now they're all really good. And same thing with the airplanes. Like what airplane am I on? They're all really good. I think there's things that you can do to kind of make your trip more enjoyable, picking different times to fly. In the morning, it's usually smoother. If you don't like turbulence, fly in the morning versus the afternoon or later at night.
Okay.
I sent you some pictures. Yeah, I don't know if you want to talk about those. There was we touched on this earlier about the uncontained engine failures. One of the pictures that I sent you was of a Delta Airlines flight from, I think it was the late 80s or early 90s in Pensacola that had an uncontained engine failure, and parts of the fan disc and the fan blades actually shot into the cabin and killed I think 2 of the passengers.
Oh man.
So a super rare event. Although we were talking about earlier how it seems like on social media you see these, there was that Southwest flight, the United flight. If you really are concerned about this and you want to minimize risk, even though the risk is already super low, remote of it being any problem, there's things you could do as a passenger. Don't sit near the airplane. Near the engine. Don't sit near the airplane.
Don't go in the airplane.
Just stay at home. Sorry, I misspoke.
Freudian slip. Yeah.
Just stay at home, sit in your easy chair, and you're good. No, but don't sit near the engine. I mean, if you think of, you see that engine hanging on the wing in its pod, its nacelle. When it's running, it is a bunch of moving metal parts, and when I say they're moving. I mean, many tens of thousands of RPM.
Damn.
And so, that's a piece of machinery that if it has a problem is going to throw parts out. And so, look, if you want to avoid the very, very low risk of that being an issue, don't sit near the engine, sit behind the wing.
So to go with that though, if an engine goes out, how many engines can a plane fly on safely? I mean, can you actually get down with one and land? And then second to that would be, as you mentioned, don't sit near the engine. where is the safest place to sit on an airplane?
Yeah. You can land with no engines. If everything's great, like let's just say we're flying along in our 737 and somebody made a mistake and we ran out of gas. And this has happened before with a 767, a really famous one in Canada. If you run out of gas, something happens called a flame out, which basically means both your engines quit. Well, you're a glider at that point. Now, thankfully, the plane still works, right? There's still a battery. There's still electricity to power some of the instruments. There's a thing called a rat, which is basically like a little propeller that comes out of the bottom of the airplane that can run the hydraulics. So the plane is a glider, but the pilots can still fly it. Well, if there's a runway nearby, you could, in theory, if you're skilled enough, dead stick it or glide down and land safely. So, it's all hope is not lost if something like that happened. But these planes can fly safely with one engine, no problem. So if one engine quits or fails, or they have to shut it down for any reason, you can, they're going to divert most likely to the nearest suitable airport. But they can be flown and landed. It's basically like a normal flight.
Because you get those pieces flying into like the picture, and I'll put up the picture for this so people can see it, into the cabin. Now, once that's pierced, and I know that Southwest one, the woman got sucked out. I mean, is that a real danger of the cabin ripping apart? I mean, what happens once you start puncturing holes into that?
Great question. The best example I can give for a person to kind of understand the strength of a fuselage is to think of a soda can. It's a thin piece of aluminum, very, very thin, just like an airplane fuselage. If next time you go out, you board an airplane, as you pass through the doorway, take a look at how thin.
I don't know if I want to do that.
It's super thin. I mean, we're talking less than it's an eighth of an inch, maybe less than a quarter of an inch in some places. So, I mean, it's super thin, but it's strong, and it's strong because of the shape that it's in, right? And there's other things too called stringers and other sort of, construction components, but a soda can is pretty strong. I mean, you can push on it and it will hold its shape and it'll hold its contents and everything. But if you take that soda can and you take, a pen and you stab a bunch of holes in it and you start twisting it and moving it, it's lost its strength because you've weakened the continuity of the skin. And so yes, any damage to the fuselage, say from components of an engine that come apart and fly into the fuselage, it does weaken the strength of the fuselage. But so far, in most cases, the fuselage is still strong enough to hold the plane together. There is a very, very dramatic, and anybody can Google this and see the photos. It was a very, very dramatic structural failure that happened on a 737 flying in Hawaii I think it was the early 80s. And I want to say the airline was called Aloha. I don't know why I can't remember this exactly, but basically it had a fatigue crack in the metal, and the entire top part of the fuselage over the front of the airplane peeled back.
Oh my God.
And so it was exposed to the outside. This plane's flying around with basically a sunroof, a huge sunroof. And they landed safely. And there were, overall, the plane was kept intact and landed. So it can be done. Control can be maintained, and you can land even with catastrophic damage to the fuselage. But yes, in those events, if there's some sort of structural damage from flying metal or whatever, that does increase the chance of some sort of structural failure, catastrophic structural failure.
So when we talk about, and I kind of diverted you there, where to sit on a plane that's safe. So if an engine explodes, are the parts, just the way it's going in the physics, are the parts kind of going straight in sideways? If they do, are they shooting forward, backward?
It's usually along the plane of the rotating fan. So if you think of, a fan blade is kind of aligned perpendicularly to the fuselage. Usually if there's a failure because it's spinning so fast, it's flying straight out into the fuselage. So if you're on the airplane and you're kind of walking back to your seat and you look out the window and you see the engine right there, if you're in front of the engine or if you're behind the engine, usually that's completely safe. Also, if you're behind the engine, you're usually over the wing. And so that's safe too, because that's going to block any sort of pieces that are flying. And I have to reemphasize, this is a remote chance of this happening, right? But it has happened. And so, if you want to maximize safety, and you asked about the safest place on an airplane to sit, this is something that's actually tracked by the NTSB. In fact, I sent you a page out of an aircraft accident report from Delta 191, which is an L-1011 that crashed in Dallas back in the 80s. It flew into a microburst, which is from a thunderstorm.
Okay.
And the only real survivors in that plane were in the very back of the plane. And historically, that has been the safest place. Now, it's not always the case. Sometimes, depending on the type of crash or incident, that's not a good place to be. But historically, if you went through and just the numbers, generally speaking, the back of the airplane tends to be the most survivable for a variety of reasons. But on that point, when a plane crashes or has an incident, goes off the end of the runway or whatever, in most incidents, the fatalities are not caused, the bulk of the fatalities are not caused by blunt trauma. They're caused by smoke inhalation and burns. So that's something that, if you want to talk about survivability of crashes, what it really comes down to is getting out of the airplane as soon as you can if there is a crash. Whether it's going through a door and down a slide, or if the crash is really severe and the fuselage has come open, broken apart, through a gap in the fuselage. So a lot of these things are, not in your control, right? I mean, because who knows how the plane is going to crash if it's crashing. But those blunt force trauma deaths are through history not always the biggest cause of death. It's more post-crash fire and smoke inhalation. So maybe something to remember.
Yeah, maybe we could do this. Maybe we could just talk about, if you're in a crash, maybe some steps that people can do, or when you're going on a plane, what you should pay attention to. So maybe the first thing when you're boarding the plane, maybe obviously where you're sitting. I mean, if you want to I don't want people to be sweating, but just, worst case scenario, have us in the back of your mind. Because my son, when we flew last, my son pulled out the little card with all the safety information there. And I kind of looked at him sideways, like, what are you implying here, bud? What are you doing? Put that back. But I mean, I would imagine it has a lot of good information on there if you can get past the, don't think about it and it won't happen thing.
Right.
But
no, he's smart.
Okay. He's like,
it's good info.
So I guess, you're getting on a plane. What should you pay attention to first? I've heard counting seats from exits, all that stuff. In your opinion, where do you start?
If you can sit by an exit, do so. Not only is it more leg room, but getting out is important. If you can't sit by an exit, really take a look and know where it is. Get a visual. Sometimes when people go to the airport and go on an airline flight, they're just like on autopilot, pun intended. They're not really looking. They're just kind of moving. Be observant. Look to see where that exit is. Read the manual, the safety card, and learn how to open it. It's all really straightforward. You're just pulling a lever or rotating, it's very easy. But read it. Just know how it works and know where it is. Now, if you do have to evacuate, this is the part that kind of gets a little bit crazy. And this is, I don't know how you can control this, but don't grab your bag. Don't worry about your bag. Even if you have your laptop and your medicine and, a gift for your niece in the overhead bin, leave it. Let it burn. Because there have been numerous evacuations that have happened over the last 10, 15 years where there's video because someone has their phone with them. And you see what looks to be kind of mayhem in getting the slides opened and getting people off the plane. And then you start to notice when you see everyone coming down the slide and moving away from the plane, they're carrying their luggage. Which means they stopped and blocked an aisle and opened it up and futzed around with it. And it's that's not what you're supposed to do. So overcome the property preservation instinct
Yeah.
and just get out of the plane, because that's the safest thing to do.
That's what scares me, because it's human psychology. People are going to panic. There's going to be people grabbing stuff, maybe even fighting each other to get to the exits, crawling over seats. And that was my worry, because I actually took myself mentally down the road a little bit when in terms of crashing, like what would I do? How would I get to an exit? And that started to actually concern me more than anything else, was just how everybody else is going to respond and maybe the fight to get off. Is there a time that if you're not off the plane that your survivability goes way down?
So yes, there's unfortunately there's a crash that happened, and I want to say it was a TWA flight in the late 70s where there was a delay, or maybe it was another airline, I forget. But there's definitely a crash or an incident where there was a post-landing fire, and the delay in evacuating the plane was a huge contributor to the loss of life. Now, there's a bit of a weird balancing act that happens here. And this is probably too much detail, but it's worth thinking about. The plane can actually handle a decent amount of smoke and fire, and the fire can be put out, and the safest thing to do is just stay in your seat. So let's just use as an example a fuel fire in the tailpipe of the jet engine, or maybe a brake fire. If the plane lands and that type of a fire breaks out, it's going to be visually disturbing if you have a window seat. You're going to see smoke, you're going to see fire. But it probably doesn't warrant an evacuation, because at most large airports, all large airports, there's aircraft firefighting and rescue equipment, and they'll come out and they'll spray it down with foam or water and put out the fire, and everyone's fine. The reason why I say it doesn't warrant an evacuation is invariably in an evacuation where the slides are used, there are injuries, because it's you're riding an air tube down a slide, and people land wrong, they sprain an ankle, they break a leg, whatever. And so in that situation, the best recommendation is follow the instructions of the crew, because the pilots know, based on the instrumentation they have in the cockpit, usually whether or not there's a fire, and sometimes how severe the fire is, whether it's the brakes or the engine or whatever. So plus they're talking to air traffic control on the radio, who can see the plane from the control tower. So they can advise them, hey, you have a brake fire, or hey, there's no fire, but there's smoke from the left engine. So the crew has a little more insight into how severe a potential fire is. And so listen to their instructions. If they deem the fire to be such a problem that everyone needs to get off, they'll make an announcement. There's a Easy Victor, as a lot of airlines use that, which stands for evacuate. And so listen to the crew's instructions. And if they tell you to evacuate, then evacuate, but leave your bag.
So in your experience, pilots, I mean, will the crew be honest with you that there's a problem? Maybe not as they're working through it in the air, but I mean, as you're going down, I hope they're letting you know you're going down. But do you think there's any kind of room there where they're like not quite telling you how serious something might be because they don't want to cause a panic? I know it's just kind of for obvious reasons they don't want to.
I think that has happened.
Okay.
That was never my philosophy. I think it was way better to always inform the passengers on what was going on, and probably that's what's going to happen most of the time. Certainly in the event of an emergency landing where an evacuation is possible, they're going to let you know. They're going to let you know for sure, because they're going to want everyone ready. They're going to want you to brace during the landing. It's something that for sure they're going to inform the passengers about. Now, I've had things happen before which were out of the ordinary, and many pilots won't talk about that, and that's a shame. I think you should. For example, we had one time when we just had too much fuel. We were going to be overweight, and the solution for that was simply to descend earlier and put the landing gear down earlier. 5 minutes of extra time flying around with the wheels down. Well, most people kind of know that the wheels come down when you're getting ready to land. So if it happens far away from the destination, people are going to think that's a little weird.
Yeah. So
I just made the decision to make a PA announcement and explain why we were doing it. In those types of situations, sometimes the flight crews are not as open about what's happening. But in a real, emergency landing with the possibility of an evacuation, yes, they will definitely let you know what's going on.
And regarding seatbelts, I read that for every measurable inch or whatever of slack in the seatbelt, you're going to experience more force or G-force. Is that true as you're maybe coming down for a rough landing or a wreck? I mean, should you be cinching that thing tight?
It should be snug. There should really not be any play. Yeah, because basically what happens is if there's an inch or two of slack in the belt, then that's just an inch or two that you can be thrown against it. And so it increases the chance of you having a bruise or something from the belt. It should be snugly fastened.
Okay. How much, and along those lines, how much G-force can a average person take before they're like incapacitated or whatever?
Well, if we're talking about like pulling G's, through maneuvers and stuff, I mean, most people who are not trained are going to pass out at they're going to start to pass out at the 3 to 4 G range. And by 5, they're gone.
Okay.
Loss of consciousness kind of thing. The seats, ironically, on the airplane, they're actually rated to, I think they're 40 G seats. Which is weird because that's not a survivable level of acceleration for the human body. So the seats are rated for a crash, which is, I guess, a good thing, an encouraging thing.
Your seat will be there. You won't.
Yeah, your seat will be there, but you'll just be dead in it, bolted in. No, and again, that's, the trick when it comes to any sort of emergency landing is maintaining control of the plane always. And that's the goal, right? Mm-hmm. So if something's happening where the controllability is in question, the flight crew should and will land as soon as you can. Like a big thing in the 90s, which thankfully they sort of moved away from through regulations and safety equipment, was these cargo fires. There were a couple of crashes that were a Swiss Air MD-11 was one, and then there was an airline called ValueJet that crashed in the Florida Everglades. Mm-hmm. Both of those were caused by a cargo fire, and the fire just got out of control. And what happened is it burned through control cables and electronics, and so they lost control of the plane. So in that situation, the pilots know they have to get this thing on the ground immediately.
Yeah,
because I don't want to lose control of it. A controlled emergency landing is way safer than a situation where you don't have total control and you're sort of just letting physics occur.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, that's absolutely something that I think all flight crews will take into consideration. And as a passenger, you can kind of be aware of some of that stuff. What can you do? Well, you can maybe pick a place in the plane that is statistically safer. Always wear your seatbelt, know where the exits are. Mm-hmm. That brace position is in theory supposed to help you. Okay. I think really the most important thing to do is just protect your head, because any sort of unsecured cargo, whether it's somebody's laptop in a seat pocket, or their backpack or whatever under a seat, anything that's not secured is going flying. So protect your head.
I know I've seen the ones where the people put their head on the seat, or there's the ones where you tuck your head down in your lap. Like which one's supposed to be?
That one's like gymnastics. I don't know anybody who can literally hug their thighs and do that one. So I think most people are going to do the seat in front. And I don't know that there really ever has been any legitimate study into whether or not those brace positions are effective in minimizing fatalities in a crash situation. I think it's just kind of the best attempt.
Okay.
But that's why I say protect your head, because it's way more likely that the crash is survivable. But because of the forces involved, some loose article in the cabin goes flying and then strikes you, and then that would be the source of injury.
Maybe benefit to drop your head a little bit. So for that Chinese flight that went like straight down, are all the passengers out in that instance because of the force that's being? Are they alert and know what's going on? Oh, that's terrible.
Most likely they're alert. No, what's going on.
That's terrible. So, but I've heard that's pretty much never really happens unless it's an intentional push down. Like a plane's just not going to do that normally.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm not aware of any. Well, that's not true. There have been a couple over the years. There was a 727 in California. PSA was the airline that hit another airplane and they lost control of it, and it just kind of went down into I think it was in San Diego. So yeah, there have been accidents like that over history. They're just very, very rare, thankfully. But an in-flight breakup of an airplane is only going to happen if some external force is applied to that airplane. So a collision with another airplane, which thankfully is extremely rare and gets more and more rare, thankfully, to technology that we're using now to kind of keep planes separated and aware of other planes around them, or an explosion, and usually an explosion means some terrorist, act with an explosion, because it's really not plausible or likely at all that some component on the airplane would explode on its own, and that includes things like jet fuel and oxygen. Those are not the way that they're used and they're stored on the airplane. Those are not explosion hazards in normal operation. They're just not.
And then talking about water landings, that for some reason that terrifies me, because like if you get on top of the water and then you're slowly sinking or quickly sinking and water's rushing in, people are panicking. Are you screwed at that point, or
historically they're not very survivable?
Okay.
We actually have a couple of high profile, like the Hudson River ditching that happened that were survivable. And so those kind of changed the stats on ditching. And the truth is that an airplane is actually fairly buoyant because it's hollow. And so that's a good plane. That's a good crash to use as an example. That was an Airbus A320, and it ditched on the Hudson and then floated for quite some time, long enough that the passengers could kind of go out of the overwing exits and stand on the wing and then wait to be rescued. So if it's done in a controlled fashion and the water is smooth, you're not landing or ditching on, the North Atlantic with 50-foot swells or whatever.
Oh God.
Then yeah, it's survivable. But that opens up a whole nother realm of questions, right? So like the Hudson is cold, right? But you're not going to freeze to death in a few minutes. The North Atlantic in January will kill you just by being in the water, unless you're wearing like a survival suit. So there's it's a whole other dimension of survivability. Now, if a plane, an airliner, is going to go over the water, and actually truly, because most airlines put their planes on all sorts of routes, they all have this equipment. They have rafts. Smaller planes have rafts that are in compartments that the flight crew or the cabin crew can take out and have ready if the plane ditches. The larger planes typically have escape slides in the doors that are also rafts, multi-person rafts. And so like if you're on a 777 and they have to use the escape slide is actually it's a boat. So, it's not like, anything luxurious, but in theory it would provide shelter on the surface of the water if the plane ditched.
Yeah.
So those are thankfully just so rare of an event that, it's not worth thinking about. But I will tell you that, every time I take a transatlantic flight, as we go, off the coast of Newfoundland or whatever, as soon as we start that cross of the Atlantic, I think about it. I'm like, hey, I wonder how cold that water is.
Yeah.
As I sip my, my wine in first class or whatever, I'm like, it's pretty chilly out there.
Yeah, I had thought about it because we were going to Hawaii, and so you're just over the Pacific for a number of hours, and I'm like, man, if you got down there and then like water coming in at me, and as people are trying to get out, people probably have their life vests on, and maybe some people are pulling the strings and inflating themselves as they're trying to crawl out. I just feel like it'd be another disaster, and like with the waves and stuff. And so I would take it then obviously all land emergency landings are much probably safer and survivable than any kind of water landing.
Yes.
Okay.
Likely that's true because it's a controlled thing, right? So if it's a controlled landing, then a controlled emergency landing on land is way more survivable.
And is there any benefit to padding? I read like padding your legs and putting things around you that are kind of soft, and for the impact of any kind of emergency landing. Is that just kind of BS?
Probably not. Just because if you're experiencing any sort of G-force or blunt force that would actually put you in danger of being injured or killed, no amount of padding is going to help that.
Okay.
No, I don't think there's really any benefit there. The benefit comes from having a restraint that works, so a seatbelt that's fastened and tightened, and then knowing the way out and following the crew member instructions, and then really just kind of quickly and without fuss. I know it's a lot to ask, right? But quickly and without fuss, evacuating the plane, getting away from it.
I imagine sitting within a certain number of rows, maybe of an exit, is beneficial. So you're not like trying to get past like a bunch of people like 10 rows away or something crazy from an exit, or just could be as close as you can.
I think that's fair to say. The number of doors on an airplane is actually governed by the number of seats that it has.
Okay.
So this is probably a detail that most people won't recognize, but there's some planes that actually, like a 737-900 as an example, there's actually an extra door on that airplane that if you look closely in the fuselage on most airliners or airlines in the US, you'll see that there's like a blank there. The door is actually like permanently closed off. And that's because the airlines have opted to go in a lower density seating configuration. Some airlines say, no, we're doing the whole thing is going to be economy seats and we're going to pack as many people in. Well, then that door becomes necessary because they do studies and determine, like how quickly can we evacuate all of the passengers in this plane if it's filled to capacity, if we assume all the exits work or one exit is blocked for some reason. And they do these studies when they certificate these airplanes. And so yes, I mean, I think that ultimately, if an evacuation is necessary, that if you're closer to the exit, that's overall a better thing for you in terms of survivability.
And then once you're off, get as far away as you can, obviously, in case there's a fire, explosion, or anything like that crazy.
Yeah. I mean, they always say help. If you can help, if you're the first one off, stand at the bottom. As long as it's safe, there's no fire or no other hazards, stand at the bottom and help people off, because that's really needed. The trip down a slide is fast, and you're usually sliding down to like concrete.
Yeah.
So if you can help those people, but yeah, overall, it's just get away, go to whatever looks safe, a field, if it's off to the side of the runway or whatever, but get away from the plane and then stop.
Yeah.
don't go wander further across another runway, and get far enough away and then stop and wait. And someone will come out and hopefully a bus or something and pick everybody up.
And I guess before we wrap it up, I do have a few more questions for you if you're okay.
Sure.
And I know we kind of went past a little bit, but it's kind of fascinating just hearing kind of the insider stuff. Is there anything that the public would be surprised to know about flying safety, what's going on behind the scenes that we don't really know about? And I'm putting you on the spot, so if you can't think of anything, that's totally fine. But I know just from it doesn't have to be a safety point of view, but I always wonder, like, if something's going down, are they really going to be honest with you? But I mean, it could be anything else as well.
Yeah, I think one thing that stands out in my mind is that you would, I think a typical passenger might be surprised to know just how much thought and money and time and equipment goes into safety related items. It is no exaggeration, and it's not a marketing ploy when an airline says that safety is their number one priority. And just to give you an example of that, when you board an airliner, let's say you're getting on a 737 to go wherever, if you look around, you don't really see any safety related items. You just see the seats, see the overhead bins, the windows, whatever. That screaming baby 2 rows down, But the truth is that just about every compartment in that plane has something in it that's safety related. A halon fire extinguisher, oxygen bottles, first aid kits, a smoke evacuation hood, like any unused space in that plane is packed with safety related items that are really intended to address any possible thing that has come up over the years in aviation, from heart attacks, AEDs and stuff for people who have heart issues, to to actually fighting fires and getting out and stuff. So an incredible amount of effort is put into that. And that, I think, contributes a great deal to what we talked about at the beginning, which is it really is way safer than any sort of surface auto transportation, taking a ride in a car. The emphasis on safety has been so significant over the years. And every crash that occurs ends up being a learning experience and usually a driver of change, where some regulation comes up or some change to the way things are done is done in response. That's happened so consistently over the decades that I think that might surprise people, just how much of an emphasis is put into that. So the takeaway for your typical passenger is, even if you're a business traveler and you're flying, multiple times in a given week, when those flight attendants get up and tell you to put the flat end into the buckle and lift up to release, that's actually part of a process that works and keeps people safe and makes air travel the safest method of transportation. And so we may dismiss it and kind of laugh about it and say, oh, they're doing this, and you're reading your magazine, you're on your phone or whatever. But it's everywhere. It's around you everywhere. And when you're on a plane, and it really does work. So there's not a significant reason to be concerned about your safety. Like you're on one of the safest modes of transportation.
You mentioned cell phones. You know how they have you shut off all electronic devices? Does that really impact the performance of the plane still? I mean, all right,
everybody. All right. I'm going to let you in on a secret. Okay. It's all baloney.
Really?
It's all baloney. So I did an interview recently about this because the 5G antennas posed an issue, and that was legitimate. That was actually legitimate because for one of the 5G bands, there was some overlap with a frequency that airplanes use for their radar altimeters, and that was a legitimate interference. But for the last 20 years or whatever, if you forget to put your forget to put your phone on airplane mode. It's not going to cause the instrumentation in the cockpit to go haywire. It's
where did that originate from? I kind of remember years ago. Is that just almost like a coincidence that happens? So they're like, oh, let's just be safe and turn them all off? Or
it was, I think, mostly driven by not entirely being sure. They had two options. The option, you have to think back to the 90s into the early 2000s. Cell phone technology was like rapidly evolving, and whether we talk about how cell phones work to the frequency bands and all sorts of stuff. And the FAA is maybe not so quick to react to some of this stuff. So they had two options. Option one was, well, we need extensive testing on every phone that could be carried on board the airplane and every plane system. And we need to run multiple tests and find out where the interference happens. And they thought about this and they said, there's no way we're going to be able to do this. These things are tiny. They're in your pocket.
Yeah.
We'll never catch them. So why don't we just make a rule saying turn them off? And everyone's like, yeah, that works. That's the more doable rule. And so I think that's where that came from.
Okay.
In practice, I can't tell you how many times as the pilot, I've landed and and you can actually, I don't even know if the phones work on this same frequency range anymore, but there was a little interference with like our headsets. So I'd land, we'd be taxiing in, and all of a sudden I would hear in my headset like a chirping sound, and I'm like, what is that? I look down and it's my cell phone. I forgot to turn it off, and it was making the connection with the cell tower. So yeah, there's a little bit of interference. Is it interference that caused any sort of problems? No.
Okay.
No, it's not.
Now I've heard a lot about wreckage riders, and I think reading it, I was like, this is BS. This could not have possibly happened. But they're talking about planes breaking up at high altitudes and people actually surviving the fall to the ground. Is that real? And does that happen? And then I think the articles that I read were attributing it to like holding on to any bit of wreckage and then like kind of descending down with it. One person I think hit like a snow covered like mountain thing. So it was like softer. Is that real?
It's happened.
Okay.
It's happened. There's two that I'm aware of. I think they were both children that survived. No. One was an adult flight attendant. The other one was a child, where they survived an otherwise unsurvivable crash. And I think that it would be impossible to look at that and analyze that and figure out for sure why. It's just we can just kind of attribute it to the random nature of these things and luck.
Yeah.
And luck. Because there's certainly that's the exception, not the norm.
Okay. Yeah, I won't count my odds of surviving if this plane starts breaking it up at 35,000 feet and trying to grab onto a food cart.
I've had people ask me like, I'm a skydiver. Should I bring a parachute on board? No, you're never going to get out. First of all, also you probably wouldn't be able to. They probably wouldn't let you on with a parachute. To be completely honest,
like, dude, are you going to try to open the door mid-flight?
Yeah, I think they'd probably be like, what's the deal here?
Could a door be open mid-flight? If someone forced it open, could you?
I'm going to say no. And there's a really legitimate physical reason why, and that's the pressure differential between the inside of the plane and the outside of the plane.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, the way these doors are constructed, some of them don't have a perfect seal when they're closed. And so something that our flight attendants used to do, and it used to drive me mad when they did this, but the plane that I flew did not have a sink that they could dump their coffee into. So their options for dumping coffee were limited. And some very, very clever flight attendants devised a method whereby they would take a stir stick straw, and in flight, I wish I was kidding about this. I'm not. In flight, they would press it through the seal around the edge of the door and the galley door so that it basically went outside the airplane and it would create a vacuum. And they would then pour the coffee out and it would suck out through this straw and be jettisoned overboard.
Oh my God.
And you could see this when it happened, because when the plane landed and you did a post-flight walk around, there would be a gigantic brown streak emanating from the corner of the service door down the fuselage. And they actually put a memo out. They're like, don't do that. Don't do that. So but could they open the door? No, because of the pressure differential, which is around 8 PSI. So for every square inch of door surface, mm-hmm. there's 8 pounds of pressure. Multiply that out of the area of the door, you wouldn't be able to open it. So no, it's not a real thing. That being said, there's other issues. There's cockpit windows that have come open during takeoff.
Oh man,
nothing to worry about.
Are those things are they not reported? I mean, unless there's like something that happens to the passengers that they're acutely aware of, are things, even if they're kind of serious safety things, brushed under the rug with airline? Kind of like, well, we're just doing an internal report and public doesn't need to know about that and media doesn't need to know about that.
Yep.
Is that pretty common?
Yep. Absolutely.
Okay. But nothing.
If it's not a crash where there's been like bent metal and damage or an injury, I think it has to be more than just like, I stubbed my toe. Mm-hmm. It's usually only being handled internally.
So does that skew the data in terms of safety for planes, in terms of like things maybe, or, this thing came off or this stress test went bad or something happened and we're not going to report it? Does it skew things toward looking more safe?
It depends. Because if it's something serious, like mechanically, there is a report made.
Okay.
But it's not something as a member of the public, you'd have to go digging for it.
Okay.
You'd have to either request it or, through a FOIA request, or maybe the FAA or the NTSB has a database online that you could search for it. Is it a safety item? I'm trying to think of one that was common. The plane that I flew was very, very safe and reliable. It didn't really have any issues, but sure, there could be like mechanical issues that crop up enough that internally the airline is aware of it and says, we're having this issue repeatedly, and then it's handled in a way that's essentially non-public.
Okay. I mean, that's not a surprise, but yeah.
You know what? There's a way that you might be able to see this. So there's this thing that the FAA does. It's something called an airworthiness directive, or AD, that they publish. And an AD is kind of like an emergency order that says everyone who operates this plane needs to change the way they're doing things. Either they need to replace an item or inspect a part every so many hundred hours or whatever, or so many hours. And usually that comes from reports from operators, and so if you go pull up the ADs, the airworthiness directives, and you can do that, it's available on the FAA's website. You might see there's an AD for a particular component on a Airbus A321, let's say. Well, why is that? Probably because there were issues with it, or it could be general aviation aircraft, same kind of thing. But there's probably enough issues reported with it that the FAA said, we have to do something. We have to take action to maintain the safety of air travel.
And you mentioned something earlier in terms of like AI systems and like a cyber attack or something happens where you could hack something. Does it exist now to where any kind of, I guess, the countrywide system could be hacked or messed with in a way that would affect airplanes in the air in terms of like radar or any kind of like operations and just cause mass chaos in terms of planes not knowing where other planes are?
I think the answer to that question is yes.
Okay, because
I think currently there are vulnerabilities that are either known and not quite addressed yet, or unknown. But I don't have any specific answers. Like I can't point to any particular one. There's just a movement toward having these things be more networked than, so here's an example. The plane that I flew, and older planes that still are flying, when they want to update the navigation database or whatever, the maintenance staff have to actually go on board with a disk or a flash drive. The plane is essentially air gapped so that those updates can be done by only authorized people.
Okay.
I know that's an expense for airlines, and that if there was a safe way, and I'm sure this already exists on some planes, where they could make those updates through data link, they would, because it's just way safer. And the problem is everyone kind of gets lured into this, oh, well, it's encrypted. Oh, well, it's encrypted. Well, so what?
Yeah.
All encryption can be defeated one way or the other. So I think in some of the newer planes, there may be vulnerabilities that we don't know about, or we know about and have either addressed or have not yet been addressed. I had a passenger one time ask me, because we were talking about flying, and his seat back had a USB port on it. And I cannot really figure out why that's necessary, right? I mean, I guess for charging your phone, but a power plug would do that too. USB is inherently data transfer. So what does your seat back need? Why does an airline need to interface with their customers' data at all? You know what I mean? And so I don't know what that's connected to, but assuming it was connected to just the aircraft's entertainment system, I suppose that's no big deal. But who knows what vulnerabilities exist there? All I can say is, it's an area where there must be constant attention and focus on things like penetration testing and making sure that this is not a vulnerability that somebody exploits, because it is a very attractive target.
Oh yeah.
Traditionally, aviation, airline flights are a very, very attractive target for people with bad intentions. So if it can be exploited, it will.
Yeah. Talk about a terrorist attack, man. That would be tragic. Have you ever listened to a black box recording through to the end where it was an unfortunate outcome? Because I think a lot of stuff, you see some on the media, they'll give you part of it or something you won't, or a transcript of something, you'll see something. I was say, have you listened to that? And are there any particular ones that kind of haunt you or kind of bother you, or can you listen to these things now and not be affected emotionally, or do they still?
No, they're pretty bad. There's one in particular, and I forget the crash. But the pilot says something like, "I love you, Amy," or something is his last words, like saying goodbye to his girlfriend or his wife. I forget the exact quote. That one's tough, right? Okay. I mean, this is somebody who knows they're about to die and, has enough thought about the process to say, I better just get something on the recording. They're all pretty terrible, but they're a very, very valuable investigative tool. There was a crash in Buffalo back in, I think it was 2009. It was a commuter turboprop. And ultimately, they attributed the crash to pilot fatigue. And one of the things that they used to come to that conclusion was there on the cockpit voice recorder, there was multiple instances of yawning, overheard in the cockpit. And so, they used that plus other things, the pilot's schedules and rest history, and said, look, these two pilots were just absolutely exhausted.
Mm-hmm. Do most of those recordings that you have heard, I don't know how many you have heard, are the pilots pretty methodical in their approach in terms of trying to troubleshoot this thing? And then at what point are they, like you said, when it gets into the emotional, they realize what's going to happen? Is that usually toward the very end?
It's in the last 2 seconds. They're flying the plane all the way down to the end. There's that seat chart that I sent you, that image, that's Delta 191. That one was an L-1011, which is a big airplane. They're not in service anymore, but that flew into a microburst. They were flying that plane all the way until it broke apart, trying to escape the microburst. And you can hear it. You can hear the engines spool up. You can hear I think it was the captain saying, push it up, push it way up, meaning, max thrust. Mm-hmm. They're flying that thing, even though it probably was in an area, in an energy state where it could not be recovered. They're flying it to the very end. And that's typical.
Jeez.
That's typical.
Yeah, that's got to be, I don't know. My dad he was law enforcement. And he did a lot of like fatality wrecks. And so he would go and document like the scenes and different things. And that affects people in bad ways, like my dad would have different, nightmares and stuff for seeing things. And I wonder sometimes those NTSB investigations that go and listen to everything and you're doing that. I mean, it's got to affect you. I would think, if because you're seeing like a window of the crashes, that, even if they're rare, you're seeing a lot of them. Do you know anybody who does that, and does that affect them?
I know a few of them as acquaintances, and I've never asked. It's kind of like one of those topics where it's not that I would feel bad. I just kind of assumed that was a toll that the job takes. Mm-hmm. And so I never really asked, but I'm fairly certain that that's a type of burnout that, especially the folks that are on the go team that maybe show up at a crash where there's a lot of fatality. Yeah. And so, it's kind of gross and morbid, but I mean, like in some crashes, there's like body parts, scattered around. And so that's got to be extremely difficult to encounter. Mm-hmm. So I'm sure there's a lot of burnout amongst those folks because otherwise you kind of lose the human side of everything.
Yeah. Is there a particular case of either a crash or survivors that sticks out to you and that you still kind of like you revisit mentally every now and then? Is there something that either pulls you emotionally because of the people that survived, the heroism of the pilots, or something that was just so catastrophic you're just like, geez, don't think of that before I fly?
Yeah, there's a crash that I always think of as kind of being this absurd series of events that really never needed to happen, but it also resulted in a change in the way we build airplanes that was positive. And it's an Eastern, I think it happened in either the late 70s or the early 80s. It was an Eastern Airlines L-1011 that crashed outside of Miami. And the reason why it's kind of an odd situation is that the gist of what happened was a light bulb was burned out on the landing gear indicator. Real simple, benign, no problem, right? Mm-hmm. But the pilots got so preoccupied in trying to troubleshoot the light bulb being burned out that they forgot to fly the airplane. And so it was on autopilot, and they were like standing up, they were out of their seats, they were trying to look through this like viewport to see if the wheels were down. They were troubleshooting, and somebody bumped the control column. We talked about the autopilot kicking off, and it disabled or disengaged the autopilot. And the plane, it was smooth out. It was nighttime. So they had no visual cues outside of the window. The plane just went into a real gradual, slow descent. Jeez. Nobody would know anything was changing unless you were paying attention. And they were so distracted by this thing that really wasn't that big of a deal that the plane, which was in perfect condition, no mechanical issue of any real significance, and no weather, it just flew into the ground and killed, most of the people on board, if not all of them. I can't remember if there were any survivors.
Jeez.
Just a really incredible series of events that was avoidable. And what came out of that was no autopilot can disengage without some alert to the crew. And it's loud. In many cases, it's almost as loud as the fire bell, which is probably the largest alert or the loudest alert. It's a loud alarm that goes off when the autopilot kicks off. So something good came of that. But I always think of it, I'm like, what a totally avoidable catastrophe.
Yeah.
There was nothing wrong. There was nothing broken except for just a bad series of choices by the flight crew that resulted in this crash.
And when that happens, that's logged by the computer. So then an investigator later can go and say, hey, this autopilot was disengaged at this time. That's how they figure that out.
Yeah. So the flight data recorder records multiple parameters, including, whether or not the flight controls are pushed, whether or not the autopilot's on. So combined with the cockpit voice recorder, which has an overhead microphone that records everything, but it also records what's spoken into their headsets if they're wearing them, they can piece the whole thing together, and they just they play it back, and they're like, "Is this really what happened?"
Jeez,
these guys just got distracted, and then someone bumped the yoke, and it kicked the autopilot off, and there was no alarm, and the plane and then they have the altitude data, and they can see that the plane just kind of went into this really slow, kind of gradual flight into the ground.
Man,
incredible.
And they were oblivious up until what, like warnings were going off for the elevation, or
I don't even know. I forget if they had any sort of, like, we call it JIPWIZ, which is like an alarm system. I don't even know if they had that then. But yeah, they either didn't know and didn't see it coming at all, or by the time they were alerted, it was too late and there was no way to recover, because ultimately they did go into the ground.
Jeez.
So, yeah.
I have to ask you before we end this. Have you ever seen, with all the reports in the news today and the media, UFOs? Yeah. Have you ever seen one? Do you know anybody who's seen one? And I would really want to know your thoughts about this whole thing and what's going on.
The answer is yes. Okay. I have. And I have a memory of flying. I was a first officer at the time. I have a memory of flying with this captain who, he actually passed away years ago from something unrelated to flying, but a nice guy, but just such a nervous guy, I remember. And we were flying from Cleveland to somewhere on the East Coast, and it was nighttime, and there was this light in front of us and above us that could have very easily been an airplane. But the lighting configuration was not like I've ever seen before. It didn't look like any navigation lights or, beacon on an airplane. It looked, I don't know, it just looked like an odd series of lights in a weird shape. And I asked him, I said, do you see that? And his response was, nope, and neither do you. And I said, okay, whatever. It was, you couldn't make out like a shape of a fuselage or anything because it was nighttime. But we were at probably 35 we're going eastbound. So we would have been 35 or 37,000. And it was at least 10,000 feet above us, maybe. So it would have been high. Who knows? Who knows what it was?
And that should be popping up for you guys on some kind of radar, let you know there's another aircraft in the vicinity.
No. Well, if it was close enough on something called TCAS, yes, it could. This thing didn't. And it could have been. Who knows what it was? It could have been an early form of a military airplane. To be honest with you, I see more stuff like that now from my backyard. Like we'll be in the backyard just looking up or whatever, and I'll see something moving. It's something you can see satellites, but this looks like an aircraft. And I'll pull up. I have an app on my phone that pulls ADS-B data, which should be any aircraft that's flying, and there's nothing there. And it's not in space. It's definitely in the atmosphere, but who knows? It's some unmanned drone or something.
Yeah. What do you make of? Because there's some pilots who and airlines have come out and said, yes, this unidentified event happened and this happened. And there seems to be, at least in the past, a push to keep it quiet. Like the guy you were with, like you don't see that. Um, as far as the pilots go and being, quote unquote, trained observers, when they talk about the military guys, what is your feeling about all that and what they're seeing? I mean, especially the farther back you go, the less likely it is that it's some kind of like crazy drone technology or something.
Right.
Do you have a personal belief about this stuff? I mean, whether it's a military, something that's, a little more exotic, we start getting into like kind of what has been traditionally painted as a crazy realm, but less and less so with kind of what's going on with Congress. How do you feel about it?
Well, I'll say that in light of the videos that were released recently, the Tic Tac and all that stuff, my first inclination is to believe that it's some technology that we're not willing to talk about. You can't avoid the observation. The information got out there, that people saw it, video of it got out, and that obviously it must be some human technology. That being said, these things are moving in a way that, and without any sort of infrared exhaust being visible, they're behaving in a way that is not consistent with what I know about our abilities. Mm-hmm. So, what conclusion can you draw from that? Either we have technology. When I say we, I mean humans, right? Mm-hmm. Could be any country. Either we have technology that exceeds the public knowledge of what's out there, and we're observing that in use. Or it's something completely unknown that we can't explain, and I don't know. Some of the accounts that came from that of a craft, just flying above the surface of the ocean water, causing a disturbance and then shooting up at just ridiculous speed. From what we know about G forces and piloted craft. Like no human could survive that. Mm-hmm. And so is it unmanned? And then the weird thing about unmanned flight is it's way more prevalent now for sure. It really wasn't all that great back in let's say the 90s or the 80s. We're talking about, a decommissioned aircraft that had been rigged with autopilot servos and a radio connection, kind of like a remote control aircraft. That technology isn't so hot or wasn't so hot back then. It's much better now for sure. Mm-hmm. So I don't know what conclusion to draw other than just to be massively curious about what we're seeing and keeping an open mind. But I mean, I'm not, based on the description of its movement and its lack of a thermal signature or exhaust, I'm certainly not aware of any technology that we have that can pull something like that off.
Yeah. I mean, you got to trust too. And I'm curious what you think about this because you had so many hours of flying and then you talk about military guys who've had a ton of hours of flying. Because a lot of debunkers will come out and say, hey, you just got screwed up. You don't know what you're looking at. It's just like an optical illusion or whatever else. Is that pretty rare in terms of like all the experience that pilots rack up and knowing what they're looking at because they've looked at airplanes a bunch, they've looked at birds a bunch, they've looked at all these things. How credible do you think those debunkers are when they say stuff like that?
I think they're full of it. You're talking about a group of people who generally have to have perfect vision. Okay, so if not naturally correctable to 20/20 or better. You're talking about people that are not likely to be hallucinating, given the fact that there's restrictions on drugs and alcohol consumption and they need to be rested or whatever. So just physiologically, you're not talking about a group of people, pilots, who could have something working against them that would make them see things or observe things wrong. Mm-hmm. You're also talking about a group of people who see this stuff all the time, who are frequently looking outside the window of their cockpit. And so they know what a contrail looks like, a contrail that maybe is lit an interesting way, or a meteorite, which I used to see all the time, or northern lights, or weather phenomenon, or other aircraft. You see those things all the time and you know what they're like, what they look like and how they behave. And so when some pilot reports something out of the ordinary, I think that's credible, that to really kind of pay attention to what it is they're saying. Something that kind of I just thought of that was interesting is we were never, when I say we, I mean as an airline pilot, we were never taught of a procedure to follow if we did encounter or see a UFO. There was no company policy that I was aware of on how to report those. There was no hotline to call or governmental agency to report it to. There was never really thought of as something that we needed to be instructed on. So most of the reports actually happen over the radio. You'd hear somebody say, and I've heard this before, it was not very common, but you'd hear someone say, hey, Center, what are you showing an airplane in front of us about 5 miles and 1,000 feet above? No, negative. There's no traffic in front of you. And what the pilots are doing is they're observing something and they're asking for air traffic control to look at their radar display and see if there's anything that's matching what they're observing. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it's a yes. Oh yeah, there's military traffic, 2,000 feet above you and 10 miles ahead or whatever. Mm-hmm. But sometimes it's a no, I don't see anything. So take that for whatever that's worth.
How often do you think this happens is just not reported because of, at least in the past, there was no procedure for it. And obviously now they're not going to be, hey, we're seeing UFOs daily going across the country over the water in the Atlantic or the Pacific. Is this happening a lot more than is being reported?
I think so now. And I think it's actually driven by something that is known, which is drones.
Okay.
I think drones are just way more common than we think, both the legal ones, the store-bought ones, or, purchased ones. And then also people can kind of construct their own. Mm-hmm. Nations can construct their own military forces and such. And these things are, for the most part, small enough to not show up on what we used to call primary radar. The way radar coverage is with air traffic control in the United States is changing. The system used to be based on really what amounts to like World War II radar technology, which was robust, but it's also wildly expensive to maintain. Mm-hmm. And so what we used to have is this thing called primary radar, and then you'd have a transponder on board that would provide altitude information to air traffic control. And so they'd have a nice little blip on their screen and know where you were and how fast you're moving, your altitude, et cetera. We're moving away from that and into this autonomous ADS-B type system, which is where basically the plane has equipment on board and it's constantly broadcasting its identifier, its altitude, its movement, its speed. And so it's kind of like a user-based system versus a separate government-run system that scans for this stuff. Mm-hmm. What that means is you could have drones flying around or even small manned aircraft like a paraglider that is not necessarily visible to ATC, either because of its size, and so it's not very radar reflective, or just it's in an area where there's no good radar coverage and it doesn't have a transponder on board. So I think that's actually increasing. And if you look online, you'll see occasionally there's these weird stories. Actually, in LA, it was happening a couple times where these pilots coming into LAX were reporting a man in a jetpack. I don't know if you remember that story, but they're coming into LAX and they're like, "Hey, tower off the right side, about half a mile, we see a man in a jetpack," and they're like, and so really, okay, that's interesting. We don't have him on radar. And they would just alert the other airplanes coming in. Do you see this guy? Do you see this guy? And so that was a thing for a while. And who knows what that was? I mean, that could have, there is a jetpack thing, right? Yeah, that technology exists. So it could have been a man in a jetpack, or it could have been somebody who stole a mannequin and turned it into a drone, and flew it around. And, here's the thing. If we ever do catch that man in the jetpack, it's not going to be through radar. It's going to be by finding his TikTok.
Yeah.
Because none of these people are doing this stuff unless it's being filmed, for the internet points. Yeah. So that's normally how this stuff is going to be discovered.
Yeah, it's unfortunate because I feel like you're never going to get the truth now because it's such a convoluted mess of the government hiding stuff, drone usage. It's like the technology is getting to a point where unless they come out and just are very transparent about it, which I don't think the government ever will be for obvious reasons, they don't want to.
When have they ever really been?
Yeah. And who wants to say, hey, guys, this is aliens and we have no control over it. Sorry. That'll freak people out. If they have some kind of dark or black technology that's like super secret, they don't want to let you know. There's no incentive to me. So to me, these congressional hearings are kind of a joke, but we'll see. I don't know.
Yeah, we'll see. I would love it if we knew. If here's kind of what I think. If it is our stuff, our technology, you're never going to get the truth because there's a tactical advantage to having it be secret, right? We don't want an enemy or a foreign power to know about it. And so this is just some sort of distraction. If it's alien technology, then there's two reasons why they won't let anybody know. Number one, they don't want to have a panic and they think they know better. And, so they're never going to, let the information out. But number two, they don't know what they're dealing with. And these people that are entrenched in government always want to appear as if they're in control and know what's going on. And conceding that this thing popped up that they had no idea about doesn't look good for them.
No.
And so you just never it's way easier just to conceal it.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the likely outcome. You'd have to have like a whistleblower who's like, no, this is alien. And of course, as soon as they do that, they're going to be like, oh, well, listen to the conspiracy theorists, know?
Yeah, I don't see any incentive for them to let anybody know because you can just look at what happened with COVID and toilet paper and people panicking and running to a store. What are they going to do when you find out, hey, there's some weird ancient thing that's been here a long time? It goes into the water. I mean, it's going to blow up people's religious beliefs, going to blow up, everything about people's perception of the world and control. It's just like, oh.
I used to think, years ago, like, who cares? Let people know the truth. And I still deep down think that, right? But I don't know. In the last 2 years, I've evolved a little bit to really appreciate stability. Anything that doesn't, rock the boat or like, tip over the house of cards. I have to balance that, right? I'm probably always going to lean in that. Just tell us the truth. We need to know the truth. But man, stability nowadays seems like such a wonderful thing.
Yeah, I agree. And especially myself, I have a family. I don't know if you do. I have 3 little kids, and it's like you see some people, and you get into the political realm, and people going, "There needs to be a civil war," and you get all this craziness, and you're like, "No, there doesn't. I need stability and safety, and like trying to do this any other way possible." But you appreciate it so much more as you get older.
Yeah, maybe that's what it is. I'm in my 40s now, and so before I was like, now I'm kind of like. No, boring is great. Trust me.
Yeah. Well, Josh, thank you so much for coming on. You're being really generous with your time, kind of like explaining to us all these ins and outs and safety and flying. If there's any last, tip you want to give people before we go, and then also if anybody's interested in finding out more about you, where could they go and find more?
Yeah, I mean, the tip I would leave everyone with, if the concern is about aviation and air travel, and I mean this sincerely. It is so inherently safe, and crashes and fatalities and injuries are so rare that you really can feel confident when you get on board an airplane and you travel commercially. You really can. It's still an incredibly safe mode of transportation. So safe that, of course we all think about all those unlikely scenarios and the worst case scenario, whatever, but it's so remote of a chance of happening that you really can just recline your seat, use that Wi-Fi on board, have a vodka soda or whatever, just relax. Everything's going to be fine. It really is. That's what I would say to anybody who's a possible air traveler who's watching this. If you need to get a hold of me, the best way to do it is probably through my Aerovise website, which is just AEROVISE.com. That's the aviation consulting site. There's an email address on there. If you email me about UFOs, I'm going to plead ignorance on everything.
Yeah, I'll let you go over this, but is there anything that you know about UFOs you can't tell us? Or
no.
Are you strict? Okay. So no,
I have no government affiliation. I don't have any military background, and I have no NDAs or anything that if I knew, I would tell you. And I don't. I just, all I can say is I've seen things that are curious, but nothing that drives me to any one conclusion. And I just remain curious, like I think most people are.
So don't
and keep an open mind.
So don't email Josh with any weird questions.
Please don't, because I don't know. I really don't know. I'm just like you. I'm just fascinated by it.
All right, Josh. Thanks again.
All right, my pleasure. See you.